Good afternoon. My name is Mike Fagelman, and I'm the Executive Director of HonestReporting Canada. Thank you all for joining us for today's urgent insider briefing. Malcolm X once said, "The media are the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that is power, because they control the minds of the masses." In the past 2 weeks, we've seen an unrelenting onslaught of media bias against Israel, waged by Canadian and international news providers, the likes of which we've never seen before. In the backdrop of recent hostilities between Israel and Hamas terrorists, our media singled out Israel for opprobrium, perpetuated outright falsehoods, and resorted to grotesque moral equivalences. It has taken a Herculean effort by our organization and by pro-Israel advocates worldwide to promote the truth, to expose the lies, and to repel the bias. In a concerted effort to equip you, our grassroots supporters, with the tools to help you advocate for Israel, we've organized this important briefing. And now, I have the great pleasure and unique honor of introducing you to HRC's co-founder and chairman, Mr. Jonas Prince.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome to all our viewers today. We have a very large and diverse group. We're privileged to have a very special guest today who needs no introduction, and in fact, has said, "Don't bother to introduce me. There's a lot of material to cover." Well, I'll skip the introduction for Ambassador Michael Oren, known to everyone, but I will make two preliminary remarks. When we at Honest Reporting met to decide on who is the person best able to explain what is going on, to give us some light, to demystify and unpack the confusion in the media, we all came up instantly with our first choice, which is this ambassador, and we're privileged to have him. The second preliminary remark I'll make is that when he was doing a book interview recently with the Jewish Standard on a recent book of fictional short stories called The Night Archer, the interviewer started this way: "The problem with interviewing Michael Oren is that you just don't know where to begin or where to end. His accomplishments are so many and varied." Well, I know where to begin, and it's in Gaza, and it's with Hamas. And as a preliminary matter, and welcome, Ambassador, it's an honor for us to have you here today. But as a preliminary matter, as I say, we have a diverse audience, and there'll be time for questions at the end of this thing. But there is confusion in some people as to what is Gaza, what is Hamas, what is the West Bank, what is the Palestinian Authority? And briefly, and I know that's an impossible task, but briefly, could you please give us set the stage for what we're about to talk about before we get to the meat?
First of all, Jonas, the pleasure and the honor is entirely mutual, and I'm really delighted to be speaking to Honest Reporting and your supporters throughout Canada, and I believe the United States and the world as well. Good evening to everybody from Jaffa. What is Gaza? Where is Gaza? What is Hamas? Can you distinguish the two? Historically, Gaza was it always was a coastal area. In terms of its civilization, it was advanced. The Philistines lived there. You got a bad rap in the Bible. You don't want to come up against the Philistines in Gaza in the Bible, especially if you're a Samson type person. But historically, Gaza was the interface between civilizations. It was the scene of great battles. It's linking continents. It's linking cultures, and it was always a dynamic and effervescent area of the Middle East. In the Middle East, in the Middle Ages, under Arab rule, Gaza fell into desuetude. It became a very backward place and never fully recovered. But Gaza's role as a sort of this interface between cultures and clashing armies continued. Continued during the Napoleonic Wars of 1798 after the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt. Napoleon invaded Palestine through Gaza. World War I, some of the bitterest battles fought between the Turks and the British were around Gaza. And in the 1948 War of Independence, the Egyptian army moved up through Sinai into Gaza and remained there after the war. Now, according to the UN partition plan of November 1947, Gaza was to have been part of the Palestinian state, much as the Judea and Samaria, what we call, widely known as the West Bank, we call Judea and Samaria, was supposed to be part of the independent Palestinian state. And whereas Judea and Samaria were occupied by the Jordanian army and annexed by Jordan, Gaza was occupied by Egypt, but not annexed by Egypt. Refugees from areas in southern Israel, particularly in Jaffa, nearly quadrupled the native population of Gaza. The native population was largely Egyptian, and the Palestinians who resettled there were quite different, were more advanced than the native population. Nevertheless, many of those refugees were resettled in refugee camps in Gaza. Between 1948 and 1967, Gaza was the scene of sort of a hotbed of terrorist activities backed by the Egyptians. Was almost constant fighting along that border. The Fedayeen, those of you remember the name Fedayeen, the Fedayeen were born in Gaza, Fedayeen meaning self-sacrificers. And it was the fighting around Gaza that helped precipitate the Second Arab-Israeli War in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. But it was only in 1967 that the Israeli army entered Gaza. It didn't intend to enter Gaza. It wasn't part of Israel's war strategy, but fire on Israeli forces from Egyptian regulars and Palestinian irregulars in Gaza led to a very rapid takeover of Gaza on June 7, 1967. Then began the Israeli occupation. And it was during that occupation that starting in the late 1970s, Israeli settlements were built in the Gaza Strip. Some 21 settlements were ultimately built, most of them clustered around the coast in an area known as Gush Katif. There was one settlement, Kfar Aza, which had been actually existed before 1948, but had been evacuated in the face of the advancing Egyptian army, and that was recreated. Gaza remained a hotbed. I spent a lot of time in Gaza. During the first Intifada, patrolling the streets. It's a miserable, fetid place. You don't want to be there. And this is well before Israel withdrew from the area. During the second Intifada, in particular, Gaza became the hotbed of Hamas. Now, Hamas emerges in the 1990s under the leadership of a wheelchair-bound spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is not all that distinguishable from Al-Qaeda, from ISIS, from Taliban. It's a Sunni purist movement which seeks to recreate the caliphate in the Middle East. And ultimately that caliphate will expand to include the entire planet Earth, because that's the will of God, was that the Quran and Islam take over the entire planet, but they have to do it in stages. And for Hamas, the first stage is getting rid of Israel. It wants to establish an Islamic state, not a Palestinian state, an Islamic state in place of Israel. And then that Islamic state will eventually expand to include the entire Middle East, and as I said, ultimately the planet. That's Hamas. Indistinguishable, I say, from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But its focus is on Hamas. And strangely enough, I think rather unconscionably, Israel turned a blind eye to Hamas. It actually looked upon Hamas as a natural foil or counterpoise to the secular Al-Fatah organization, which led the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 1980s and 90s. And Hamas grew. Hamas grew exponentially. And also Hamas was not, in contrast to Al-Fatah and the PLO, Hamas was incorruptible. It was very pure. And much like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And many Palestinians gravitated toward it. In 2005, August 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided enough was enough, and he was going to pull Israel out of Gaza. I was part of that operation. And I've been in many wars, too many wars, about 35 years of service in the IDF. There was nothing that was remotely as traumatic as a disengagement. It was actually the largest Israeli army operation since the Yom Kippur War. About 55,000 soldiers took part in it. And we pulled people out of their houses. I say this not with any sense of pride. We pulled people out of their houses. Israel destroyed, uprooted 21 settlements, moved about 8,000 Israeli citizens out of their houses. And the goal was to create basically an embryonic Palestinian state, a mini-state, that would enable the Palestinians to exercise their right to self-determination, at least in a preliminary way, and live side by side with us. And it completely backfired. No sooner had we withdrawn from the Strip than rockets began to fall. And began to fall in increasingly large numbers. Israelis were fatigued by this point that we weren't responding to the rockets, so they just multiplied. And then in 2006, there was a Palestinian election. Hamas won that election. It was the last Palestinian election. Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank Palestinian Authority is entering the 16th year of his 4-year term. Hamas won the election. Al-Fatah refused to accept the outcome of the election, and so Hamas went to war against Al-Fatah in Gaza. And the American-trained Fatah forces quickly folded to Hamas. About 300 Fatah officials and soldiers were executed, most of them in the streets. Some of them were tossed off the top of buildings. This was Hamas. Okay, New York Times did not publish the pictures of those people that Hamas threw off the top of buildings, I guarantee you. And Hamas instituted its rule. The infrastructure that Israel had left behind, much of it financed by American Jewish philanthropists, such as the greenhouses, were dismantled by the Palestinians, torn apart.
Michael, is it fair to say that if you took a snapshot today from what you're saying, Hamas is a terrorist organization, has been called that by the United States, European Union, other countries. Mm-hmm. Its mission is the eradication of the state of Israel. There's no doubt.
For many years, Joseph, it had a charter, and the charter was an anti-Semitic genocidal charter. It accused the Jews of starting World War I and World War II, like viciously anti-Semitic. And its goal was, of course, the eradication of Israel and the institution of the caliphate. In recent years, they have whitewashed their charter. Their charter reads like something out of a Che poster now. It's about liberation and self-fulfillment, and it's very clever. They're smart. They are not stupid, and they have disseminated that charter. But Hamas is not just theologically Islamist. It actually acts on it, and in this way, they're sort of in contrast to the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hamas invested nothing in infrastructure in Gaza. Gaza has about 4 hours of electricity per day. 96% of the water there is not potable. And Gaza invests every cent, and Hamas invests every cent it has in building tunnels. Close to 100 kilometers of underground tunnels have been built, bunkers, and rockets. Rockets which are, pardon me.
Let's get to that and where their money, we'll see that in the war. But just let's speak briefly the prelude to the war. Every war starts with some little events that become big events and spark things. So here, what we see in the media is you've got the claim that the Israeli police come into the holiest site in Al-Aqsa and disrespect that, and that becomes a reason to launch bombs later. And then you have this little neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah that is a subject matter of about to be a Supreme Court decision. It looks on the surface like a landlord and tenant claim, but these become the sparks. So could you spend a minute on each of these two things and talk about how these sparks lead to 4,000 missiles launched into Israel?
But you have to put it in context. You have to put it in historical context. Operation Guardians of the Wall is the fourth war we have fought with Hamas since 2008. And every war is almost identical. In some of them in 2008 and 2014, there were ground forces involved on the Israeli side. Some of them went on longer. Operation Protective Edge in 2014 went on for nearly 50 days. In 2008, Cast-Led went on for something like 7 weeks. So very long time. So every like 3 weeks, pardon me. And with the exception of 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense, Hamas in each case fired thousands of rockets at Israel. And each of these rounds were precipitated by the very similar unfolding of events. Hamas, for whatever reason, found pretext for firing rockets. Now, sometimes the pretext was very flimsy. Hamas simply wanted to extort money out of Israel and export concessions out of Israel, and found some excuse, like Israel wasn't respecting the maritime maneuverability of its fishing boats, things like this. In this case, you're right. The two precipitating events were the Sheikh Jarrah ruling by the Israeli courts and the Israeli police assault on Al-Aqsa, which was the third highest, holiest city in Islam. And the assault, which occurred also on the holiest day of the Islamic calendar, the end of Ramadan. Well, let's start with Sheikh Jarrah, because that's the easier one. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in what was known as East Jerusalem, and we don't distinguish between East and West Jerusalem. And before 1948, the neighborhood was owned by Jews, and they were displaced by the Jordanian Legion in 1948. They lost their homes. And after the war, 1970, the owners of the home petitioned the court to return their property. And it's hard to imagine that this court case, it's like, jaundice versus jaundice, right? That it went on for decades. And finally, the case was, excuse me, was picked up by an Israeli NGO, and frankly, it's a right-wing NGO which seeks to increase the Jewish presence in East Jerusalem and elsewhere. And they took up the case and they pressed it. They pressed it in the way that the original owners could not press it. And finally, it came to a ruling, and the ruling was very simple: that the Arabs who've been living on this territory were living, illegally. They were squatting on the territory, on the property. And then the Israeli judicial system, in a rather magnanimous gesture, offered a compromise, whereas the Arab residents, the Palestinian residents of these neighborhoods, could pay rent to the original owners. Some of them agreed. 6 families did not agree. And so they were slated for eviction. Now, I think that would be the case in every court in the world. I can't think of any court where that would not be the case. Now, you can make there is a dicier issue of why Israel, as the victor in these wars, can reclaim properties that were owned by Jews before 1948, but Palestinians who were displaced by the war cannot reclaim their houses in West Jerusalem, including some very nice neighborhoods like Talbia, German colony, the Greek colony, where Arabs lived. And that is a deeper question, but that question was not what precipitated the Hamas, or enabled the Hamas to open fire. What enabled them to open fire was the slated evictions, by the way. And it's now, as you see, it's being contested in the Supreme Court. So it wasn't about these families, about people that were not imminently in danger of being evicted. But I'll reiterate, this was, I think, a very equitable and very magnanimous decision by the courts to now allow these families to pay rent. The situation in Al-Aqsa is far more combustible. There have been riots going on around the old city for days before that, in front of the Damascus Gate and around the Temple Mount. And Palestinian protesters had stockpiled stones, rocks, and fireworks in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, nobody talks about how these Palestinians violated the sanctity of Al-Aqsa by storing fireworks in there. And thank God none of them have gone off. Just as a parenthetical note, the Jordanian army in 1967 also stored munitions in Al-Aqsa. What can I say? Islam has a different notion of sacred space, but the West doesn't, and that's what they're appealing to. Now, there will be an investigation determining about whether this police operation there was necessary, or whether it was proportional to the danger. And I'm going to use that word very guardedly because we're going to be talking a lot about proportionality later. But certainly, there was a sense that at that moment, Jews were gathering at the West Wall for the holiday of for the holiday of Jerusalem Day. Many religious Jews view that as a religious holiday, and if these rocks and fireworks had been poured over on top of their heads, dozens, maybe hundreds of people would have been hurt, and probably a goodly number of them killed. So there was an imminent danger there. The question is whether the police had to handle it that way or another way. It will be investigated. The visuals, however, were terrible, and we can't dispute that. Police going into this holy place, and the way Americans understand or Canadians understand holy places, and firing tear gas and rubber bullets. Hamas doesn't need much of an excuse to open fire in Israel. It has its own agenda, whether it be extorting greater payoffs from the Qataris, or getting greater freedom of movement for its fishing boats. But the immediate and overriding impetus for the opening salvos against Jerusalem, not against against Jerusalem, was the decision by Mahmoud Abbas to once again postpone Palestinian elections. Postponing because he knows that Hamas would have won a landslide victory, and Hamas was not about to take that quietly.
I just want to, sorry, Michael, Ambassador, we talk about the war itself, and one of the issues we're going to talk about is the issues that come out as proportionality. We see these horrible images of children and family and destruction. And one of the ironies about proportionality, to me, I can't help comment on this, is that we talk about proportion, there's a death toll, and it's like projected like a hockey score, and people say, well, it's just too proportionate. How can you have so many people killed and you've hardly got anybody killed? So we'll talk about that, but the irony, and I see this, is you have Sheikh Jarrah is a legal dispute, and I like the answers or not, and Al-Aqsa, the police may have been aggressive, but where's the proportionality in 4,000 missiles versus disagreeing with 2 domestic legal matters. One, call it an aggressive police department. Yes, we've had that. We've had it in Toronto at a G7 conference. So nobody's talking about that proportionality, but that's a sidebar for me. I couldn't indulge me. That's my own mini.
But of course, in all my interviews with the foreign press during the war, I pointed this out. I said, at what point does a court decision justify the firing of more than 4,000 rockets at 4 million innocent Israelis? Where is that? And that is not, that's not an historical or a legal fact. It's a media line, and it's whether effective or not, but it's intended to embarrass the media, and it should embarrass the media because they acted abominably.
Let's deal with a few of these issues in the media. We have the casualties, the human shield, Iron Dome. And, you speak about the double-edged sword that's Iron Dome, and you've got some authorship of Iron Dome when you were.
I do indeed. I was aware of it. Was aware of it at the time. Well, let's take a few minutes to talk about disproportionality, what we call here affectionately the D word. First of all, there's a tremendous misunderstanding about disproportionality. Under international law, proportional force is the force that is required to eliminate a threat. And clearly, with rockets still firing at the end of every war we've had with Gaza, we have not eliminated the threat. So by definition, our response cannot be disproportionate. So put that aside. No one actually looks at the legal definition of disproportionality. But yes, and Hamas loves the D word. Hamas is all about the D word. And one of the principal aspects of Hamas's, I would say, tactic versus strategy is that Hamas seeks not only to kill our citizens with their rockets, but I think more importantly from Hamas's perspective, it's to get us to kill their civilians in response to the rocket fire. Hamas does not invest a single cent in civil defense. It doesn't invest in bomb shelters. It doesn't invest in air raid sirens. And I mean zero. All the money goes to tunnels and blockades. They actually want a high level of civilian casualties. And there have been cases where Hamas headquarters, for example, Hamas will force civilians onto the roof and try to keep them there and literally use them as shields. They want those casualties because Hamas does not have a military strategy. Hamas knows that with all of the rockets, they cannot destroy the state of Israel. Nothing. But what they can do, they can have a military tactic that serves a media, diplomatic, and legal strategy that will ultimately deny us the right to defend ourselves and perhaps even the right to exist as an independent Jewish state. And you can actually see that happening in the pages of the New York Times and elsewhere. And how does it work? It's a brilliant tactic. So they get us to fire back at them. We kill their civilians, unintentionally, of course, and regrettably, of course. The media images go out, and they are brutal. It immediately inflames the Arab street. Now, the Arab street used to actually be in the Arab world, but today the Arab street is in Paris and in London, and increasingly in the United States, North America. That's where the Arab street is. That, in turn, puts pressure on governments to put pressure on us. It finds expression in the UN Security Council, ultimately in the ICC. And that's what Hamas is about. And it works very methodically. War after war, eroding, grinding away at our legitimacy. And you've seen just a superb example of it in this last campaign. Superb how it worked. And so Hamas is very much in league with much of the media. The media is a tool for them. In 2018-19, there were mass demonstrations along the Gaza Strip. And what certainly many Israelis didn't understand, and certainly the media didn't understand, was that the demonstrator was the new rocket. And the demonstrator was actually a better rocket because it could be used multiple times and was more visual, and actually didn't cause damage on the Israeli side. It only caused damage on the Palestinian side because our soldiers were 10 meters away from their settlements and they had to defend the settlements. And so Hamas kept on sending these young kids up to the fence. Excuse me. We had reports that kids were being paid $500, which is a lot of money in Gaza, to get a bullet in the leg or bullet in the arm. They actually go up to Israeli soldiers and get them to fight because that was the visual that they wanted. They wanted the visuals of Palestinian kids being shot. And the world, the media loved it, loved the pictures. I mean, we made mistakes too, but every vision, every image you saw of the Gaza protests was from a Palestinian perspective, none from an Israeli perspective. Because we don't internalize it, what Hamas is about. We don't internalize the military tactic, diplomatic, legal, and media strategy, which is really what Hamas is about. And they're very, very good at it. I got to tell you, John, it's very good. A word about Iron Dome. I haven't talked about Iron Dome because, yes, I did bring the money for Iron Dome. I was very proud of it. It appears in my resume. And I was acutely aware, even at the time, that Iron Dome is, as you said, or quoted me, is a double-edged sword, because Iron Dome creates disproportionality. Few Israelis are killed. By contrast, far more Palestinians are killed. I was actually asked on no less than 2 very serious international interviews, why doesn't Israel provide Iron Dome to the Palestinians?
Well, in fact, doesn't Israel, the Hamas has an Iron Dome. It's called "Don't fire your missiles into Israel." Isn't that their Iron Dome?
Well, I've heard that said, yes, but that it just belies their whole strategy. Their whole strategy is disproportionality. They have other strategies that I'm happy to talk about too. Go ahead.
As a soldier, as a diplomat, if you were there advising, the first missiles are coming in, and you get a call from the prime minister at the moment, BB, and we'll see what happens. We'll talk about that. What are the choices militarily once the rockets start? What could anybody, whether it's BB or anybody else, what choices do you have as the prime minister, as the chief of the IDF? What can you possibly do differently?
Well, for about a year and a half, when I was in the Israeli government, I was in charge of the Gaza situation. And I learned things about Gaza. You know, here I had served as a soldier there. I'd served in several battles there. And I thought I knew a lot about Gaza until I got into this job. And I found out I knew very little about Gaza. And just to tell you an anecdote, as part of my introduction to Gaza, I spent an entire day with the Southern Command of our internal security service, the Shabak. And the head of that branch is now the National Security Advisor, Mayor Ben Shabbat. And as my introduction, he flashed us a slide on the screen. It was a picture of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, standing atop a pile of rubble that had been a house, and he's given the victory sign. And Mayor asked me, "Is that a triumphal picture or a defeat picture?" And I said, "Well, it's a defeat picture. He's standing in front of a pile of debris." He says, "No, that's victory. For Hamas, if it doesn't lose, it wins. Every time we blow up houses, that shows the Palestinians and the Muslim world how much Hamas is fighting and suffering for the Palestinian cause, and that he is still standing atop that is the ultimate victory pose." And I had to learn this and internalize. I had to internalize that Hamas maintains a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. It keeps the people weak. It keeps the world feeling sorry for them. Read the front page of the New York Times today about how terrible life in Gaza was before this battle. It was terrible in Gaza because of Hamas. Israel has the capacity to move 1,200 truckloads of food and construction material and medicines every day into Gaza. And every day, Hamas stopped about 800 of those trucks.
Let me pull. I just want to go a little more geopolitical. Let's pull the lens back a little, widen the lens, and look at the role Iran plays. Hamas.
I'd like to answer your previous question, though. What can be done? All right, before we get into Iran, it's a whole different kettle, okay? What can be done? Well, among the considerations of the Israeli government on how to respond to Hamas rocket fire is, to what degree will an Israeli response benefit Iran? Because what we're basically fighting here is a proxy war. Iran is the major backer of Hamas. Iran is the sole owner and operator of Islamic Jihad. So we're fighting a proxy war. And what Iran wants is to get us bogged down in the ground war, because Iran is willing to fight Israel to the last Palestinian. Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority also cuts off vital aid to the Palestinians. The PA pays unemployment, it pays medical expenses, it cuts it off because the PA wants to fight Hamas to the last Israeli. So we have to think about, okay, who are we benefiting by going in there? And then the big question is, once we go in there, if we drove Hamas out, went house to house, and say 500 Israeli soldiers were killed, what do we do the day after? Who wants Gaza? Do we want the Palestinian Authority there, the way it used to be? And understand that if we put the Palestinian Authority there, it's only going to be there at the edge of our bayonets, and our bayonets are going to have to maintain them there because they can't defend themselves. These are very weighty issues. And so the Israeli government has determined again and again, by the way, the first government to fight was the Olmert government, not a Netanyahu government, that the best way to respond to this is first from the air. And if that proves inefficacious, then just from the ground. But the goal remains the same. It's to whittle away at Hamas's rocket ability and to maybe reinstill a sense of deterrence. That is the best you can do. But even that response, in view of the international reaction to the Guardians of the Wall operation, that response is also now becoming very, very problematic.
We don't have time today to talk about Turkey and Syria, but we do have time to talk about the United States, and that's something that, as ambassador from 2009 to 2013, you were there when Bibi comes back in office. You're there under Obama's watch. You became conversant with what is now President Biden, because I think he became your point of contact, your POC, because Hillary wouldn't take your calls. I think you said once.
Really?
Well, that's
True.
Backdoor channel, but it worked out well. You have now familiarity with probably most of the people on the ground who were on the bench during Obama's time. I want to read you something you said from your amazing book, Ally, where you talked about the time between being announced as ambassador, but not yet having taken the role officially. You call that period boot camp, and you say, now emerging from boot camp, I knew at least what was required to survive in this complex and potentially hazardous diplomatic world. I would have to master its nuances, its pitfalls, and its twists. I would have to learn the full meaning and the limits of that deceptively straightforward word, ally. The book was called Ally. Would you call it Ally today, and how have things changed, and what did you learn?
I think it's Ally with an asterisk. And I think someone pointed out, I think it was Danny Gordis reviewing that book, that the title was meant ironically. And I actually debated whether to put it, like a question mark after it. Yeah, so what is the meaning of the word ally? Listen, I can say many things about this. I know that the Obama administration sought to downgrade that alliance in various ways. One of them was the Secretary of State not returning my phone calls, which was completely a radical departure from previous relationships, with the relationships of previous ambassadors with previous secretaries of state. A very radical departure. Joe Biden wouldn't go along with it. That was the thing. Joe Biden actually is very pro-Israel, deeply in his heart. But that doesn't mean that he is not at variance with our policies. And he is a Democrat. And he does support a two-state solution based on the Obama and Clinton parameters, 67 borders with mutually agreed swaps, Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. And he is deeply committed to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and renewing it, all of which are at variance with Israeli policies. The latter, the Iranian part of it, is a strategic, if not existential, danger to the state of Israel. During the last round of fighting, the Biden administration, I think, exhibited rather extraordinary diplomacy by keeping differences, out of the public eye, by reiterating its support for Israel's right to defend itself. But inherent in that is a fundamental contradiction, because the administration will uphold Israel's right to defend itself against two Iranian-backed terrorist groups, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But that same administration seeks to renew a JCPOA, which will give Iran not tens of billions of dollars, but hundreds of billions of dollars. And I guarantee you that money is not going to build schools and hospitals. It's going to be to strengthen immensely terrorist groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, which will be aiming tens of thousands of rockets at our home again. So that kind of contradiction we're dealing with. It's a hard one. My first conversation with President Obama was about Gaza. He was wrong. He was pressuring Israel to bring in concrete after the 2008-2009 operation. The first thing I said to him, Mr. President, any piece of concrete, if there's any bag of concrete that's going to go in there, it's not going to be building houses, it's going to be building tunnels. And several years later, Dennis Ross, who was also president of that meeting, came out and publicly apologized and said Israel was right. We were wrong. But we also went through the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010. We went through the Gilad Shalit issue, the release. All of them were periods of intense friction on these issues. Ultimately, the administration understood the blockade, why we had to blockade not food or medicine. We had to blockade what was called dual use items, like a 2x4. You bring a 2x4 in Gaza, it's not being used for, for a schoolhouse. It's being used to build a tunnel. So we had to keep 2x4s out. Cement was a big one. And they understood our need to interfere with the Turkish flotilla that was not full of peace activists, but full of Turkish-backed terrorists. and yet, to the outside world, they were unwilling to cooperate fully with us, and they pressured us in many ways. It was there was, I think, ultimately a fundamental lack of understanding and cooperation on Gaza.
From the presidency today, and this, I want to turn to the media, the anti-Semitism that we see in the streets, but just before that, and maybe linking this to the Democratic Party a little bit, we know that President Biden, and we know that you're a supporter of him in the sense that he's a good person. He's been a big supporter of Israel, and he's done a good job up until now as pertains to this conflict. But he's got to balance the left wing of his own party. And we have people like Rashida Tlaib who have picked up on this, I call it a slogan, but this phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It's become a refrain. It's code for eliminate Israel. Everybody knows that the river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Med, Palestine will be free means take it all over.
I think in fact, John, it's the very few people know.
So that's this.
I think very few people know it. So it becomes a slogan, and people recite it, and they have.
Well, Rashida Tlaib knows it, and so when she knows it, and when she says, and here's what she said, and this is part of this clever progressive strategy of linking American problems, and particularly Black Lives Matter, and projecting this into an Israel context, political context. What she says is, quote, what they are doing, the Israelis, to the Palestinian people is what they continue to do to our Black brothers and sisters here. And then she says, from river to the sea, Palestine will be free. As we know, as some of us know, quote, President Biden, sitting across from her in Detroit, which is her hometown, I admire, says to her on television, I admire your intellect, I admire your passion, and I admire your concern from so many other people. And God, thank you for being a fighter. So he's endorsing her publicly. At the same time, he's trying to keep his own power base and do some juggling. But this becomes part of the pernicious anti-Semitism we've seen. And I wanted to, and we're now seeing some, let me say this, we're used to the mainstream lack of reporting. Honest reporting covers the things say that are wrong. That's easy. But the things that they don't report, we've talked about that. And the hypocrisy in the media. The social media, where it has no accountability, and you have people jumping onto the slogan, and the last example was Bella Haddad, and I had to laugh this morning when someone sent me a little video of Bill Maher. I'm not totally a fan of all the time, but anyway, he says, calling out this recent edict in Gaza by Hamas that is kind of misogynistic and homophobic, that says no unmarried woman can go out alone unaccompanied. And he says to Bella Haddad, if you and your friends were in Gaza, you'd last one day before you went running to Tel Aviv for safety. So, but they are this legitimization of attacking Jews everywhere, not with nothing to do with the Israel conflict. And the example that's given is the Chinese can imprison 1 million Uyghurs, Muslims, and no one's beating up Chinese in the street. The Syrians can kill 500,000 people, including many, many Palestinians, and nobody is beating up Syrians. And the Russians can move into Crimea and nobody's beating up Russians. So this clearly enlarging the scope of, if you're a Jew, denounce. We've seen this in Toronto with an arts organization. If you didn't denounce your Zionism, we can't support you. We will boycott you. So this kind of crime for being a Jew, I don't think we've seen since the 30s in Germany. But I'd be curious to know, from your perspective, what, if anything, can we be doing on this front of social media?
Let me just announce with the breaking news about Nostalgic Minute has announced that he's going to join with the opposition and try to make the anti-BB Change Coalition come about. My gut feeling, and I often do political commentary on the radio and TV, is that Netanyahu will not take this sitting down. He's going to pull out all the stops right now and try to whittle away at this coalition and wean members of, particularly of Naftali Bennett's party, away from his party, so they will not be able to form this coalition. But it's a dramatic development here. We see what happens. But it's not over. And if anything I've learned about Israeli politics, it's always premature to eulogize Mr. Netanyahu. Always. This is. So what do we do about anti-Semitism? Here in Israel, we are focused on what's happening politically here. We were focused recently on the internecine violence in our streets, including in my streets here in Jaffa. I was very upset. It was actually much more upsetting than the rockets. Was the rioting going on in the streets? We have our own issues. And the crescendo of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic noise, and I stress that noise, particularly now in North America. I think it's actually it's deafened the anti-Semitism of Europe, if that's possible now. Is not of particular relevance to most Israelis in their daily lives. It's just not, and they've reached. There's the old Zionist conclusion is if you don't like the anti-Semitism, move here. But there's a new approach, and I encounter it more and more among young people, and makes my job as someone who's engaged in public diplomacy very, very difficult. And that is, no matter what we do, no matter how humane we act, no matter how many risks we take to limit, civilian casualties, whatever we do, the world's going to hate us, and they're going to use us as an excuse to expose, to give voice to their fundamental anti-Semitism. And it has nothing to do with what we do. It's about who we are. And don't waste your money. Don't waste your money. Don't waste your breath. Don't waste your effort. It's a lost cause. And I will tell you that approach, the lost cause approach, has deeply informed Israeli policymaking at the highest levels. Deeply informed. That's lost. And that if you have resources, and I'll end with this, Charles, invest it in your base, invest it in the people who are with you, strengthen them. It's a triage thing, but the others, just leave them. Because the people who believe, who chant, from the Jordan to the sea, to the people who like the New York Times, like the New Yorker, like the New York Review of Books, but any publication that has New York on the title, are assiduous, I can't stress this enough, assiduously determined to delegitimize us and deeply long for our disappearance. I can't put it any other way. It's a deep longing. Most of them are Jews. There's nothing we are going to be able to say that's going to change their minds. And there's a notion I keep hearing from some people, including very well-informed people in the United States and Canada, that if only we had instituted a two-state solution, then this would all go away. Which of course is very, very wishful thinking, because no one was talking about two-state solution when 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. And we could have a two-state solution tomorrow. I don't know if it would make any material difference whatsoever in the rising anti-Semitism around the world, which has many causes. It's economic dislocations. It's the need to find an enemy in an increasingly confusing world, the black and white solutions. It makes my job very difficult, because I am doing Hasbara for Hasbara. Okay, I'm trying to uphold the importance of what I do and what you do in honest reporting, but in a world in which facts become increasingly irrelevant, and where the term honest reporting is rapidly becoming an oxymoron. That is a difficult task.
Well, you have a moral clarity, and maybe we're back to our Abrahamic roots, where Abraham was called the Ivri, the other side, and it's been our history from our starting point. that traces back.
I'm so glad you said that, because I use that example all the time. That it was God said to Abraham, okay, everyone's sacrificing their kids, but you're not going to do that. You're going to be something different. And yes, we're going to go against the grain. And we are a strong country. We're one of the world's strongest countries. We're one of the few countries in the West that's willing to stand up and fight for itself. We are one of a handful of democracies in the world, really a handful, like 5, that has never known a second of non-democratic governance. And we're the only country on that list that's never known a second of peace. We're a very resilient country. You know, an hour after the ceasefire was declared, the beaches here were full. I would like to have seen that, you know, in my home state of New Jersey. It would have been locked in for another 3 weeks. Incredibly resilient, tough country. And okay, if we can't do anything to change the New York Times or change the slaves of the world, we'll move on. We will continue to enrich our country, to strengthen our country, to enjoy life as independent citizens of a sovereign Jewish state. And that's the reality.
I have to say that I try to think about the moral clarity. We talked about Abraham and the principle about loving our neighbors, and we just passed the remembrance of Lag BaOmer here not too long ago, and trying to honor our colleagues. I have a tough time honoring some of the people I see on Al Jazeera and not to mention Russian television. You expect to see them there, but on CNN, where you see Jewish commentators picking up the narrative. I saw a woman on one of the shows who was a young, vibrant, articulate woman espousing the Hamas narrative without creating any balance. And I thought she would do less harm if she were in a bunker in Gaza with her finger on a rocket launcher. I just try my best to respect their point of view, but it's so hard to see the criticism from some of the Jewish organizations themselves who picked the wrong time and the wrong place, which is not to say you can't be critical, but at least tell the true and the balanced story. Does that bother you as much? Should I be bothered less by this?
No, I just don't know. I don't know why you have to respect a patently false position. I don't know why you should feel compelled to respect it. You know, I was in a discussion today in Jerusalem about anti-Semitism, the way American Jews are dealing with anti-Semitism or not. And I said, one of the great conflicts we have, one of the great challenges we have in fighting anti-Semitism in North America is that, first of all, American Jews, I don't know about Canadian Jews, can't even agree on a definition of what anti-Semitism is. It's very difficult to fight something if you can't define it. Whereas in Israel, we have no problem defining it. There's a great deal of this debate whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. To what degree is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Okay, you know, when Saturday Night Live comes out and makes a joke based on the assertion that Israel only gave vaccinations to its Jewish citizens and let the Arab citizens die, which is patently anti-Semitic. It's a blood libel. Is that anti-Semitic or is it anti-Zionist? That's one problem. The next problem is that in the woke culture, anti-Semitism has been downgraded into sort of a social faux pas, because racism is based on power and influence and privilege. And since Jews are powerful and affluent and privileged, then hatred of Jews can't be on the same level as other hatred, say, of people of color. And so Jews now many Jews, certainly the liberal Jews, are reluctant to call out anti-Semitism as every bit as horrendous as any other form of racism. We're playing into that game of going along with a downgrade, which I think is a huge mistake,
Well, unfortunately, the elites on the university and the progressive Hollywood types, there's no time for study or reflection or history. It's purely, and I don't think there's a lot of anti-Semitism. Personally, I just think there's a lot of ignorance for many of these people that just can't be bothered. There is anti-Semitism out there, but I think a lot of ignorance. I don't know what we do that. But Ambassador, I promised our audience we'd have a chance for a few questions, and we're rounding up to the hour here, and we can go on for a long time. You're an endless source of knowledge as a diplomat, a historian, a soldier. But let me go to a few questions, if you'll allow me, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to ask a few questions that have come in, and there's been loads of questions coming in. So this is in no particular topical order, but one question. Given 75% of Jordan is populated by Palestinians, why isn't it widely recognized as de facto and therefore de jure Palestinian state?
It's always a good talking point. It was one of Ariel Sharon's favorites before he became prime minister. And historically, it's completely accurate. Jordan was part of what is today Jordan was part of the Palestinian Mandate. It was divided by the British in 1921 and again 1925, and it tore apart the Zionist movement, into basically the revisionists and the Labour Party. And yes, the majority of the population is Palestinian, and the dynamic part of the population, the economy, is Palestinian. So walks like a duck, talks like a duck. Why isn't it a duck? It's not a duck because it's in the interests of the United States and the West, and I must admit, for Israel as well, to have Jordan as not a Palestinian state. That's the only reason. It's not, because of a deep and abiding respect for the Hashemite dynasty, a dynasty that was created by the British and plucked there, first out of the Arabian Peninsula and then out of Iraq and Syria. And, it was a tool of British imperialism. It should be, it's so funny that Israel is considered a colonial state. We came into being in opposition to British colonialism. Jordan is actually a creation of British colonialism. And, but it's just an interest. It's a simple interest. It's interest of the Gulf states as well. They want that buffer. I think we probably all want buffer. But factually, it's 100% correct. And you could use it in your argument saying, no, use it in your arguments. Why isn't it a Palestinian state?
Okay. Next question. This is pretty wide open and impossible to answer in the time we have, but I know you'll do it. What are the visions for the end of the conflict held by Hamas and the PA?
Well, there's no end for the conflict with Hamas. There just isn't. Unless you want to send the Israeli army in there and go house to house, alley by alley, and ferret them out at tremendous human cost, both to our soldiers and to the civilian population, to our position in the world, and to the great benefit of Iran. And unless you had the full cooperation of the European countries and the United States about rebuilding Gaza without Hamas on the day after, which I don't see happening, certainly not with this administration, it's not going to happen. There's no other option. You're just going to have to wait it out. Unfortunately, Hamas remains very, very popular. It keeps its own population impoverished, hungry, thirsty, unemployed, and yet it's popular because you're in the Middle East. And economic interests are not at the top of people's priority agendas here. Other things are spirituality, family values, Islam take precedence over that. For the West Bank, really, even there, I'm going to put my cards on the table. I've been I started my political career, my public career as an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin, and I've been involved in the peace process pretty much from day one at various levels. Most recently, I was involved in as an outside consultant on the Trump peace plan, which, by the way, I think is the best peace plan we've ever seen. Unfortunately, it has that name on it, which automatically disqualifies it. Palestinians rejected it. Hey, the Palestinians rejected Clinton's peace plan. They rejected Obama's peace plan. They rejected the UN peace plan. They rejected the Peel Commission report of 1937. Why should the Trump peace plan be any different than other peace plans? But people always say, well, the Palestinians rejected it. To me, it's kind of visible. But it's right now the Palestinians have no leadership. Prior to tonight, we had no leadership. Even if Mahmoud Abbas has no plenipotentiary powers, even if he wanted to negotiate, he can't negotiate on the behalf of the Palestinians. And his signature on a piece of paper would mean nothing. In the last 100 years, I cannot point to, I cannot adduce any evidence that would support the notion that the Palestinians want or are capable of establishing an independent state. The 60 years that preceded the establishment of the Jewish state was a period of intense debate and institution building here. So that when the state was created in 1948, it wasn't created on nothing. It wasn't created on an empty foundation. Palestinians haven't gone through that conflict, that process at all. I don't see a debate about the future Palestinian state. I don't see the institution building. And I think the Palestinians are telling us something all the time. They don't want it. And no one's internalizing it. They want to come back. They want to come back to Jaffa. I understand they want to come back to Jaffa, We keep on trying to sell them a West Bank state. They don't want a West Bank state. They want us not to be here.
Certainly, as you say, from 1948 to 1967, when Jordan controlled the West Bank, there was no motivation, there was no movement, there was no terrorism, there was nothing about a West
There were no
Bank.
Palestinians. People, the word Palestinian hardly existed. If it did, it usually referred to a Palestinian Jew before 1948. But I'm just saying that in theory, a two-state solution would be a solution. But I can't think of any evidence that would indicate that it could be a reality. Here's another point to ponder: the position of the United States, and I'm willing to gather that, willing to wager this position of Canada as well, is that the solution lies in two states for two peoples. Okay, you know that formula. Do you know that no Palestinian has ever or will ever sign on to that formula? Because the Palestinians don't recognize the Jews as a people. We are a religion, and we are interlopers. We are, colonialists from Europe. We are the survivors of the Holocaust that Europe dumped here. That's their narrative. Why make peace? Why make a permanent, legitimate peace with an interloping, trespassing colonial state that has no legitimacy in terms of self-determination? It's amazing. Everyone talks about two states for two peoples, but the Palestinians never talk about that. Nor do they ever talk about an end of claims or end of conflict, because a two-state solution for them is an interim stage. It's never the end stage.
Let me ask you, we're switching topics, but question concerning the United States. What effects are Biden's changes, such as renewing major funding to the PA, UNRWA, Gaza? What will they have? And the second part of this question.
I have an answer for that one. If you get the version.
Let's answer that one.
Okay. So when President Biden was elected, I got onto Israeli media and I said, okay, this is what he's going to do. He's going to reopen the Palestinian consulate in East Jerusalem. He's going to renew funding to UNRWA and other Palestinian agencies. He's going to reopen the Palestinian embassy in Washington, D.C. And he's going to try to keep Israel from building too extensively in Judea and Samaria. And that's precisely what he's done. I'm not a prophet. I know the Democratic Party platform. I know Joe Biden. This is what he's going to do. And what impact does this have? Absolutely none, really, because the peace process is a non-starter. And I think that the president is smart enough, and the Secretary of State is smart enough to know that, President Obama and President Bush invested vast amounts of time and resources in trying to move the Palestinian-Israeli needle forward, and none of them succeeded. It didn't move an inch. And this administration has other fish to fry. It has the U.S.-Chinese relationship, U.S.-Russia relationship. It has monumental domestic challenges. It's not going to invest energy in this thing the way John Kerry did, or even Hillary Clinton did. They're just not going to do it. And when Tony Blinken was here last week, he talked about all these measures, but he never once said the United States was going to relaunch the peace process, ever. It is, having said all that, is unfortunate, because one of the contributions that President Trump made to peacemaking here was he changed the rules of the game. According to the old rules of game, if you received a peace plan and you rejected it, the next peace plan would be better for you. So you always held out for the third and fourth iterations of the peace plan. That's what the Palestinians did in 2000, 2001, 2008. Along comes Trump and says, no, in the business world, if you reject the first plan, the second plan is worse, not better. Pay a price. And President Trump also reversed the decades-long practice of rewarding the Palestinians for leaving the table. Every time they've left the table, they got more. So now the Palestinians have left the table. The Palestinians left the table during the Kerry initiative. They haven't come back to the table. And here they get all these rewards. So wouldn't it have been better if the administration had said to the Palestinians, we're going to reopen the consulate. We're going to renew support for UNRWA and other agencies. We're even going to open up the Palestinian embassy in Washington, D.C., but you are going to drop out of any action against Israel in the ICC. You're going to suspend, efforts like that horrible op-ed by a PLO advisor, Diana Batu, on the front page of the New York Times, which was ultimate delegitimization. We're supposed to make peace with these guys when they write articles like that. You're going to stop that. You're going to stop the incitement. You're going to start teaching your kids to slit the throats of Jews. I was in Knesset. I headed a classified subcommittee on these issues. And one of the issues we looked at was Palestinian textbooks and Palestinian media. This is of the PA, not of Hamas. Jonas, I've seen a lot in my life. in war, I came out of these meetings sick to my stomach. PAs instructing kids how to cut throats, literally, okay? The administration could have said to the PA, this has got to stop. But instead they got rewarded for walking away and teaching their kids to kill Jews. That's bad diplomacy. It's just not smart. That's what I feel.
Ambassador Michael Oren, I can't thank you enough. We could go on at great length, and that's why you're in demand. And I thank you for shedding light on these issues. That's your mission. It's our mission. It's what you're supposed to be doing. God bless you for the work you're doing and continue to do. It's been an honor to have you here today, and keep doing the good work. I'd like to thank all of our viewers today. We have an incredible audience today. Thank you very much. And as the ambassador says, keep the moral clarity as to what's right, and we just have to keep doing the right thing and ignoring the noise and the distraction.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Michael. Over to you.
Right there. Take care. Be well. Be of good heart and strong heart and courage, as they say in the Bible. Take care. Thank you, John.
Mike Fagelman.
Ambassador Oren, thank you so much
Thank you,
for such a tremendous honor and privilege of hosting you today. And we know how busy you are during this time, and it means so much to us and for everybody who's on this call. About 2,000 people who have joined us today, for your taking the time to educate and empower us. On behalf of Honest Reporting Canada, on behalf of our 50,000 subscribers, thank you for everything you've done for Israel, whether militarily, politically, in the diplomatic sector, or rhetorically, to safeguard the Jewish state and to safeguard the Jewish people. To our viewers of today's important briefing, thank you for taking the time out of your busy Sunday to join us. As you know, our efforts are only made possible thanks to your support. We're a nonprofit organization headquartered in Toronto, and we rely on personal donations, large and small, to create these kind of important briefings, and also to help in our work to fight media bias against Israel. So if we can count on you to make a contribution, it would go a long way and would help to fuel important efforts like these. If I can encourage you to go to www.honestreporting.ca/donate. And finally, as we conclude, I want to appeal to you all. Israel is in a time of tremendous need. Jewish communities worldwide are being targeted. Our organization is here to support you in every way possible, but we need your help. We need you to be our de facto Iron Dome against media bias against Israel. And we're here as a resource for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me personally or to our staff to support you in every possible way. And that's today's Insider Briefing. I want to thank you all for joining us, and please stay tuned to our next briefing in about a month or so. And Godspeed.